to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink.
And today we will be discussing 1973's Idaho Transfer.
Dad and Louis are trying to get it together to secretly transfer a lot of young people into the future, bypass the eco crisis or whatever it is, start a new civilization.
Daddy can't come, huh?
Something to do with the kidneys. Louis says his curtain is for anybody much over 20 to try it.
Idaho Transfer tells the story of Karen Braden, a teenager who comes to visit her sister at a facility where her father has set up a program where they are practicing time travel. There is some kind of catastrophic event that they're preparing for that could wipe out civilization, and they're trying to figure out a way to send young people to the future to set up a new civilization. This is a film that was made for, what was our estimate, of roughly $150,000, we heard Peter Fonda say.
So originally we couldn't find much information about the actual budget, so we figured we put it second to last in the series just because it seemed like that would fit there, which we're still going to do, but I did recently watch an interview with Peter Fonda where he mentions sort of in passing that a friend originally approached him to make a film for $150,000, and that's how this film came about. So we still don't have an actual number for the budget, but so, we figure we're just going to throw it in here
we'll
and
guesstimate.
We'll guesstimate, and as we're doing for most of these movies, because we don't really have any hard figures. But Jeremy, this to begin with this one, Idaho Transfer. It's safe to say this is one of the lesser known films that we've discussed on this podcast. Would you say that? Yeah,
I would, and I think it's kind of born out of a time when there was a lot of pretty radical experimental filmmaking going on. I think that Peter Fonda was really involved with Roger Corman, and then of course he made Easy Rider with Dennis Hopper, which was a huge deal at the time. It was kind of that counterculture thing. But moving into the 70s, I think some of that 60s counterculture, the culture itself, but also the filmmaking was kind of dissipating a little bit as New Hollywood started to come in. So these kind of movies, these experimental films, I think a lot of these kind of movies got lost. Particularly, a lot of the 60s Corman films they pop up now and then, but they're not kind of hailed as the great, masterful films of the era. But this was a fun little find. I had fun watching this one.
Yeah, it's a sort of a hidden gem because not many, as we said, not many people know of it. But Peter Fonda, being such a well-known actor and well-regarded actor, particularly for Easy Rider, this is kind of it's interesting that he only directed 3 films. They were all in the 70s. Yeah,
it looks like he did a film called The Hired Hand, and then which was a Western, and then he did Idaho Transfer, which is the film we're talking about today, 2 years later, and then he did another film called Wanda, Nevada. So not a particularly prolific directing career.
No. Much more of an actor, obviously. And all 3 films seem to be pretty different from one another. I think this was the only sci-fi one that he actually made. It's interesting because I think this time period, like you mentioned, Jeremy, there was lots of experimentation going on, lots of awareness culturally and environmentally, which has a big impact on this film and relates to what's going on today, discussions about global warming and things like that. I thought it was very relevant, this film, which is one reason to seek it out. Mm-hmm. And it is called Idaho Transfer, and they certainly use that locale to their advantage. So this was filmed in the Craters of the Moon lava fields in Idaho, a big state park there, and they use it very much to their advantage. It's breathtaking, some of the scenery just to kind of take in and in between scenes because this film is very dialogue heavy, much like Dark Star, and the film we're going to talk about after this primer. Very dialogue based, but it does give you moments to just kind of take in the scenery and just kind of breathe and think about what's going on a little bit, which I appreciated. But what did you think about where this film took place?
Yeah, I liked it. I thought it was a lot of fun seeing a sci-fi film kind of set in the middle of nowhere.
Almost like a desert, yeah.
Yeah, it's this really beautiful desert setting. Basically, as I mentioned a little bit, they have this kind of weird. The way it all works is a little bit confusing, or at least it was to me. because they would time travel, but they would end up in a different location, like 10 miles
Right.
away.
It
Which
didn't look too different.
yeah, which they stated it right away. So they set their rules up, but it was a little strange to me because I couldn't quite figure out, how did they get a machine in that one spot, whatever. But it was kind of interesting because it was a creative way to deal with a low budget, which is something we've talked about a lot, is a lot of these low budget sci-fi films that we've watched so far, they're building sets a lot of the time to get around that problem. Or they're shooting in like contained locations, and it was kind of fun with this because outdoors really has no era linked to it. So they really got around that problem in a creative way. Also, there was one thing which was kind of goofy at times, but also another creative way to avoid having to put any high tech equipment in. Is like the time machine itself was basically just this bench that people would sit on.
Right.
And you would press a few buttons, and to get to travel through time, they had to take their pants off for some reason.
Yeah, I definitely want to discuss that because it's very unique.
Yeah, which is an interesting decision. Once again, this is coming from the Roger Corman. I don't believe this was a Roger Corman film, but some of the same people were involved in those. He was kind of mostly known for his exploitation films, so there might have been some of that. But also it's just creative because it gets rid of the need for them to have to, get in any kind of fancy machine or wear any kind of fancy uniform. It was another nice way to cut budget.
Definitely unique, much like the setting as well. So as you mentioned, Jeremy, you said that a lot of these films that we're discussing in the series, they use that small budget to their advantage. And I definitely see that being done here. And it makes sense for the story, too, because the scenery kind of goes along with what the characters are feeling, and they feel isolated. They feel lost and scared. So they're walking through these in the middle of nowhere. They're just walking through a desert or around rocks and dirt and stuff like that. So I thought it added to the film overall. And also, another factor that the filmmakers used to their advantage was the fact that only younger people under 20 in the story of the film can handle the effects of time travel. And I thought that plot point was actually very pretty brilliant because I'm sure they only had access to younger people, most likely people they went to school with or just younger friends of theirs that they knew. They were, I'm sure, in their early 20s when they made this film. So that was a clever way to kind of get around that aspect of it.
Yeah,
I thought.
Younger actors and. Yeah, it did. It felt like a young film. It was kind of a fun little romp. The discussions. Because the nice thing, one thing I really did like about this film was that coming out of this hippie counterculture, some of the discussions they were having, some of the problems they were facing. It wasn't just the time travel. It was also kind of like boyfriend girlfriend-ism and that kind of thing, which is kind of fun to see. And once again, a lot of these sci-fi films can have a self-seriousness to them sometimes, as we kind of discussed last time. Dark Star broke away from that, and I think that this kind of broke away from that a little bit too. It also kind of dealt with, issues. I mean, I don't know if in the 70s, I read a New Yorker article recently that said that in the 70s people were starting to talk about climate change a little bit, so it's possible that was on their radar, but this idea that there's some catastrophic event coming and they have to figure out a way to save the human race by going to a different time period and preparing, is something that could easily be a thing that people are talking about today in a less speculative manner. In the New Yorker article I read, there was a whole piece of it of how people have talked about, can we get to Mars to avoid climate change rather than dealing with the problem at hand. So I thought that was interesting too, this kind of young, progressive philosophy towards sci-fi.
It is interesting that some of these sci-fi films nowadays they don't seem as far-fetched.
No,
really, some of them.
No, not at all.
But going back to what you said about young filmmakers, I just realized now that all the films that we've discussed, pretty much, all of the filmmakers have been fairly young, either right out of college or even still in college when they were probably developing it. And that's going to follow through actually into our last film as well. So why do you think? Do you think there's a reason for that? Do you think just maybe being young, idealistic, having these kind of outlandish ideas that you want to see on the screen, do you think that adds to that? Or what do you think?
I think it's probably that in combination with a lack of connections, funds. It's it's not unreasonable for a young person to pull together, 50, 60,000. It's still a lot of money even today to, someone who isn't in the film industry without, financial backers. But, it's the kind of thing where you can just kind of through loans or maxing out credit cards or whatever, I think a young filmmaker can pull together enough money to pull off this kind of thing.
But why do you think they go for these more lofty ideas? Do you think it's just being ambitious at that age?
Yeah, maybe ambitious or maybe just, sitting down and thinking about, sitting down and looking around and saying, what can I do that's kind of fresh and fun and unique? I think as a younger filmmaker myself right now, I see a lot of what's being made around me by my peers, and a lot of it kind of falls into this, pretty true to life, realist set of films, or television or web series or anything like that, which makes a lot of sense because you're young, you have what's around you, you have an apartment you can film in. So the idea of doing something sci-fi is not something I think a lot of people necessarily pursue. I think it's maybe a little scarier. It doesn't. There's not a clear connection as to how someone could pull that off. So I think for a lot of these younger directors, if they have an idea that feels like something that could maybe be different than what everyone else is doing, it's exciting. Particularly to you look at some of these names we've mentioned, John Carpenter, George Lucas, Peter Fonda. These people who throughout their careers weren't afraid to go against the grain. So I think that being able to do something for less money that didn't necessarily feel like it was made for less money, or even if it didn't feel like it was the conventional thing to make for less money, was probably exciting for them. I mean, what do you think, Mark? Do you think that had something to do with it, or?
Yeah, I think something about these ideas spoke to them. I think part of it is being young because you tend to have loftier ideas and maybe more ambitious ideas when you're younger, I would imagine. So I think that's part of it, and also just maybe that's what they grew up liking, and they, when they finally got the chance to make their own film, they were all gung ho to just make a sci-fi movie, and I think that's why they did it. So. To get back into more budgetary talk, as far as effects go, you mentioned the time travel device, and that, to me, we might as well just talk about it. So the time traveling device itself. So you have to take your clothes off, and also the way you sit in it, one person kind of straddling behind the other. What did you make of that? Do you think that was intentionally sort of sexual in a way? That's kind of the feeling I got from it. Do you think, because a lot of the conversations in the film revolve around procreation and things like that. Do you think that had something to do with why they set it up like that?
Yeah, I think, it's one of those things that goes back to, I'm not sure if, because this was also a time when, the boundaries of what you could show on screen in terms of sex were kind of being pushed. And these days we have HBO, so, nothing sacred. But back then, it was a big deal to kind of see some of these young people in an earnest way discussing sex and their sex lives on screen, and also showing it was kind of a way to sell tickets. So it is that thing where, it's hard to be sure if it was a thing that was...
If it's exploitative or...
Yeah, if it's an exploitative thing or if it serves a story. Now, what I could see, if we're going to theorize and just keep it totally in the story and rid it of context, is that the man... so basically our main character, we haven't really discussed the main character's story. It's a little confusing to explain.
It's confusing. We had to look up some
facts. Yeah, especially there's a thing, too, to a little bit of a tangent, but they don't really get away from the 70s look here. A lot of films try to be really futuristic, but they don't. So with that, all of the haircuts are very 70s and the clothing. So at times it can even be a little hard to tell characters apart. So
for sure.
Would recommend in watching this, maybe keep a notebook or something like that, or just pay really close attention. Yeah. because it can be a little easy to lose track of who is who. But to get back, if we were to pick it apart with context totally removed, a theory that I would say is maybe that the father who created this whole project, or the man who created this, maybe made the time travel itself kind of sexual to, maybe, because the goal was for these young kids, well, not young kids, but, these teenagers and young adults to procreate. So maybe he's like, oh, you have to take your clothes off to time travel. It might have just been him trying to gently nudge them towards procreation.
Actually, that's really interesting. I didn't even think of that.
Because it does explain. It says, oh, like if you're holding metal, it can pull you apart. But there's never really anything that shows that.
Interesting.
At one point in the film, she travels with a screwdriver, and nothing
Mm-hmm.
seemed to happen. So I don't know.
That's a good theory.
Yeah, so that it might have been something with that. Also, the fact that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but I don't think the guy who created this is actually seen at any point. Am I right about that?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, so there is kind of this weird air of mystery to the whole thing. If we want to get really conspiracy theory driven, it could be, these kids are just taking drugs and, going out in the middle of the desert and tripping balls and wandering around aimlessly. But there are some there are some interesting things that I think it's critiquing though. If we get past this kind of hippie counterculture thing where maybe it could be this or maybe it could be that. At one point as they're in the desert, so basically to kind of quickly do a plot summary and like with any episode on this podcast, spoilers ahead and spoilers behind at this point. But basically this girl shows up to meet with her sister, who is already part of this time travel program. The sister shows her how to travel. It's all good at first, but then something happens to the sister where she is presumed to be dead. So then our main character kind of becomes this girl who has come to become part of the project. She goes forward. She develops this relationship with this guy. She starts to think that she's pregnant, which is very good, but then we find out that the time travel actually makes all of these young people sterile. Right. And they're basically just stuck in this future civilization without any hope of actually continuing society. But they do find these kind of wandering, basically, I don't want to say vegetables because they're able to move around, but pretty much animalistic people who aren't really communicative or anything like that. So they're trying to see, if maybe those people could reproduce. A theory I had about that, and I know I'm rambling here, but a theory I had about that is that maybe those people were some of the first ones who did the time travel. Because if we're presuming that this catastrophic event has already occurred and they're in the future, I can't figure out why necessarily these people would be in this exact spot in the middle of nowhere. Mm-hmm. It seems kind of, and how they would have survived if they were so incompetent after that event. So my thought was that maybe they were like kind of test subjects that this man had sent into the future, and they had managed to survive and find ways to eat, but something about the time travel process had slowly wiped out their ability to communicate and act as human beings.
That's interesting.
I don't know. I mean, what did you make of them, kind of those wandering people?
That's honestly the best theory I could have for that as well. I think that would make sense for what's going on. And you mentioned the scene where the group she's with, Karen, once she's transferred forward in time, when they mention that's a big plot point there, that she cannot have children, and that in fact everyone that has traveled through time is sterile. So and I think from that point on, the film gets very bleak and almost kind of spiraling downward from there.
Yeah.
But to me, that's where the film gets the most interesting. And I think more starts to happen, and it's probably about the halfway point when that occurs. And I thought that was very interesting, and I thought kind of following the character after that was an interesting way to present the rest of the story, kind of in her shoes, almost following along with her, and also to go back to, so we talked about the time travel device and how how the filmmakers got around budgetary restrictions. But one thing I wanted to bring up, Jeremy, was the something as simple as that flickering, or the fade in effect, fade in or out effect that they used, the filmmakers use when they're transporting or transferring, is actually
transferring.
I thought that was I thought that was pretty effective, actually. Something as simple as just a flicker, the character flickering in and out.
So what Mark is referring to is when our characters are actually in the process of traveling through time. When they sit down on this machine, there's this very bizarre kind of flicker dissolve effect as they're kind of being swept up and turned into, atoms or whatever happens when we travel through time. I guess no one really knows. But yeah, I agree. I thought that was pretty interesting. I think did you watch, Mark, the new, or I shouldn't say new, it was about a year ago at this point, but the return for Twin Peaks?
I did.
You did, because if I'm correct, I think that David Lynch used that same effect at
I
some
believe he
point in
did.
that series,
He, yeah,
and it
definitely
didn't.
uses effects like that for sure.
Yeah, and it felt really contemporary. It didn't feel like there's so many cheesy time travel effects that we've seen over the years that
Yeah.
are really bad with like laser beams and all that, and this one kind of felt. I mean, I don't want to say realistic because we don't know what really realistically it would
Yeah.
be like, but it did feel like,
There's
maybe
something
that's
about
kind of
it.
how it would be. You
Yeah.
know.
There's nothing flashy about it. It's just, but it's almost more to the point.
Hmm.
It's kind of because it has a disjointed feel to it.
Yeah, like
It's
think it's
almost
being
like
broken down.
yeah, it's like like jump cuts in a film. If you're editing a movie, and well, not to get too much into that, but it kind of has that same feel where one object or person jumps from one part of the frame to another real quickly, and it looks like they're almost jumping around and stuff like that. So I like that jittery feel. I thought like I said, it's nothing flashy about it, but it works. I thought it worked very well in this film.
Yeah, I agree. What do you make there? So, what do you make of the water bottles? There's this big sequence involving, at least I think they were water bottles. It was kind of this metal canteen-like object. I
You,
couldn't
m-
quite place that sequence.
you may have to refresh my memory on that one.
There was this weird sequence where our main character is kind of walking around and she starts out with one water bottle, but then all of a sudden she kind of like walks around and keeps coming back, and more water bottles seem to be showing up around her.
Okay, yeah, I do
You
remember
recall?
this scene.
I couldn't quite place what that was. I mean, this is one of those things with this
Maybe
movie.
just maybe it's just like resources, something like that, alluding to that.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things with this movie where I can't quite be sure if it's really heady and if a lot more is going on, or if it just kind of goes off the rails, which maybe is genius. But because all these water bottles, where my mind immediately went to is that because anytime you talk about time travel, I think you start to talk about paradoxes inevitably,
Yeah.
and that this was some kind of paradoxical thing where this girl was just having this journey over and over again, and like bringing a water bottle each time, which would explain her. So another spoiler alert here, but her sister actually isn't dead, even though we see her sister die on screen. She's not dead.
She's her brain is damaged.
Yeah.
Something is happening.
Something happened, but we see her later on, which also I think maybe backs up the theory that these people are just turning into these like wandering beast animal things. That maybe that's what's happening to her sister, but we see her later on. But it does seem like there is some kind of weird mistake that's happened here, that we as a viewer don't totally ever really get what happens exactly. We just understand that like something has gone awry and our main character is caught in this hellish atmosphere.
I don't know how much we're meant to know.
Yeah.
Or meant to know what's going on, really, as far as that goes. I think that's another, when you look at these low budget sci-fi films, I think a lot of the plot is probably just kind of getting around things. You know what I mean? It's like maybe not having all the explanations, having more vague explanations, maybe, which I'm fine with personally. I have no problem with that.
Yeah,
so you do see a lot of that in these types of films, for sure.
Yeah. So if we're going to talk about vague explanations, I think we definitely need to hit on the ending here.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that.
So just a little bit of summary. Basically, the film ends with our main character. She somehow ends up near this car that pulls up. There's a family in this car, and they pick her up, and then it's a futuristic looking family. It's kind of actually the only futuristic looking thing.
Yeah, it is.
The car and the family. They're wearing like these all gray suits, very 1984. But
it's almost stereotypically
like
futuristic
stereotypically, like you could have seen this in like 1950s sci-fi. But they pick her up and they put her in the back of this car, and they start driving along. And the daughter asks this question. Basically, she's saying like, "What happens when we run out?" And she's referring to the people
as fuel.
Much. Yeah. But she asked them, what will happen when we run out of them, being people from the past, and Then she asked the question, will we have to use each other? Which is a kind of interesting way to end because it
ends on a question almost. It
on a
ends on
question, yeah. But it seems like they're using our main character as fuel, which is kind of an interesting.
and it's like I said, we're kind of following that character, especially through the second half of the film. So I think when that does happen, and you're all of a sudden with this family you've never seen before, I think there is something kind of strong and poignant about that. It's maybe a bit heavy-handed, but you got to keep in mind these filmmakers were young again. So even if it's a bit on the nose, I think it is a very good ending.
Yeah.
Because
How do you
else would you
interpret
end
it?
really?
Yeah. How would you interpret that ending?
Well, it's just, it goes along with the theme of waste or using up our natural resources, and what are we going to do once that happens? Where do we turn next? So I think it's as simple as that. And I think it was just a way to illustrate that, and also to kind of pull the rug out from under you a bit, because it's sort of like a twist, not a twist, but
A little
it's,
bit, yeah.
a little bit of a twist. Yeah, it's and like you said, it's the first time you've seen anyone other than these main young people that are kind of just walking around, like wandering around the desert and stuff. And these people look actually futuristic. And
Yeah.
I guess they're supposed to be more well-to-do, or
Yeah.
people that have been living in this time period for longer, obviously. So
Yeah.
I think it's an intriguing question. It's something to keep you thinking after the credits have rolled.
Yeah.
And I thought it worked well. What do you think?
I think. I mean, now that I'm really thinking about it more, it's pretty grim. I mean, it was
Oh,
grim.
it's
It was
bleak,
grim
yeah.
the first time I watched it, but the more I'm thinking about it now is to go back to earlier in the film. They're talking about that there's going to be some catastrophic event coming that's presumably going to kill all of humanity.
What's it called? The Echo. Gotta look at it.
The ecological event, or the ecological.
Yeah. I thought they had some kind of name for it, but yeah.
The ecological catastrophe.
Crisis or something.
Yeah.
Something like that.
But basically, if we know that this big event is coming, it's going to wipe out civilization, but then, I think it's 56 years into the future, we're seeing these people still alive, then that means that they did something
Yes.
to survive.
And now we know what they did.
Yeah, which was taking up other humans. So I think it kind of gives.
It is very dark.
Yeah, it's very dark because it kind of gives this idea that the wealthy people, like if some catastrophic event were to happen, that basically the way that wealthy people would survive would be by, in this it's literally sacrificing and using them to survive. But if we were to think about a catastrophe happening on our planet right now, the people who would 100% be the first ones to go would be the people without money. It's the people who, if they live by a body of water and the ocean levels rise, they can't afford to move.
They're screwed.
So it is this kind of really
People that live up on the hill, they're gonna be
the
fine.
people that live on the hill are fine. And to bring a little bit of current events into it, because it is very poignant actually, as we're talking about it right now.
How can you not at
Yeah.
this point?
So we're talking about this in early December of 2018. And there were just some massive wildfires that swept through California.
Devastating.
And it's just devastating. Some of the worst, I think the worst that the country has ever seen.
I think it is.
In terms of damage, both monetarily and in terms of human life. But one thing that was happening out there was the wealthy, people who were wealthy enough were hiring private firefighters to fight the fires near their homes so their homes wouldn't go down, whereas the people who couldn't afford that would just have to abandon their homes and let them go. So this idea of the wealthy kind of cannibalizing the poor or just letting them go to save themselves, I think is something that's actually very poignant and that this movie hits on well. But the question that the girl asks, will we have to use each other then, raises the more interesting question of, well, if all the wealthy people are left behind, but then there's another event, who gets to survive then? Is it the super wealthy, or is it just the strongest? Is survival of the fittest?
Mm-hmm. And that's mostly the victims that you heard about were the more wealthy victims, and then like you said, the ones that fall beneath the cracks. Those are the ones that really get it the worst. Not to say that the others didn't have it bad at all, because they obviously
No,
did.
everyone had it bad, but yeah.
But I think getting to the point here is that, and actually this is probably the most quintessentially sci-fi concept I think that we've talked about so far, because sci-fi, inherently it deals with questions, and it deals with things that are happening currently, you know, and it brings it to a far out world, and maybe takes it into space, wherever. But ultimately, they're talking about the here and now, and I think this movie does that more than any of the other films we watch, I would say. Particularly even more now in 2018 than it was in the 70s, I would
Yeah.
say. And the way it ends, I think that was quintessentially sci-fi kind of concept there. And because I think that's what, when sci-fi is at its best, that's what it does. It makes you think about the here and now and question things and stuff like that. So I think that ending is it stands out. You know, and I think it's one of the more memorable moments, especially for a film that is so dialogue heavy. It stands out as one of the more, one of the moments that you remember from the film.
And you gotta love the 70s. I mean, because they would it's hard to find a movie with a happy ending from the 70s, which is kind of refreshing, because
it is.
Other than maybe the 1940s with the noir, it's kind of hard to find an era where you consistently saw down endings. You know, I mean, today, obviously an independent film, you'll see it, but like most of our Hollywood films that we've gotten for the past, basically since the 70s, maybe there was a little bit of a period in the 90s where
most
things...
I can think of is that new Marvel, or the new Avengers movie.
Yeah,
I'm not giving any spoilers there, but
I haven't even seen it. So
I mean, you just don't see that done anymore nowadays. To end on such a down note.
But it is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. It's good food for thought, for sure.
And the end credits. So on the version you watched, I don't know if it said this. There was a Latin phrase, though. Did you see this? Put in there by Peter Fonda.
I don't know if I saw that, actually. It might have been at the very end of the credits.
Yeah, I don't think it's on all versions of the film. This film is public domain, I believe. Just for the listeners out there, if you want to check it out, it is readily available on YouTube.
Yep.
And I'm probably gonna bastardize this phrase, but is it Esto Perpetua?
Yeah, right at the end there. Yeah, I see it now.
Yeah,
I don't know Latin either, so I'm not even going to try.
I'm just going to say Esto.
Esto.
It might be. I don't know. Esto Perpetua. Anyway, translated, it means let it be perpetual, or it is forever. So very appropriate for a film about time travel. And oddly enough, it is also the motto of the state of Idaho.
Interesting.
So a little bit of a double whammy there.
I wonder if it was consciously.
It must have been. I assume.
Like,
you mean like the double meaning?
Yeah, I mean, he probably thought about it, but I wonder if it was a kind of thing where it was like, oh, they filmed in Idaho and they're trying to give a little shout out to it, or if it's a kind of thing where, because it is weirdly fitting. Like, it would be hard to find a quote or a quote better than that.
Yeah, I wonder if he was maybe staring at a license plate or something, and maybe because the friend he mentioned in that interview who came up to him and asked him to make this film, I mean, maybe the friend just saw that saying there and just thought. Maybe he got the idea for the film. Who knows? Make
a sci-fi film in Idaho. I mean, it's really resourceful, because I'm sure some people who are listening to this are filmmakers themselves, and that's really, I think, the way to do it. If you don't have the budget or the resources behind you, is like take a convention and find a new way to do it for less money. So they took the sci-fi convention, but they said we're going to set it in the middle of nowhere, and it did. There were some filmmaking things that I didn't personally love. There were some moments that didn't land for me, but it was really, really exciting to see a sci-fi film just in the middle of nowhere, kind of aimless. Nothing felt high tech; it all felt very lo-fi, but lo-fi sci-fi. But there was something just super refreshing and fun and innovative about seeing these characters.
Definitely
Strung out in the middle of nowhere like that.
Yeah, if you're in the mood for it, it can be quite the trip. So just to wrap things up a little bit here, Peter Fonda, obviously he went on to be just fine. He didn't direct many other films, like we said. I think he only directed 3 in the 70s, but he's one of the most famous actors out there, one of the famous Fondas. So he did just fine. The film, though, so the film was released theatrically in 1973. It was for only a limited time, and this was because the distributor at the time, Cinemation, went bankrupt during the first week the film was released. And only in 1988 did the film resurface on video. So that is part of what makes this a cult film, is it finds life later on. It didn't do well when it came out, but now people talk about it. And I think that's a common thread for a lot of cult films, most of the films that we're going to talk about anyway. So another thing that we usually try to wrap up with is our favorite moments, things that stuck out to us. This being, again, such a conversation-heavy movie, was besides the scenery, was there anything else that you thought stood out to you from this movie?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the ending I really loved. Then there were just, not like a specific moment so much, but just kind of the way that they approach nature, that they weren't afraid to use these kind of big, lofty, wide shots. I thought that had some production value. I liked that the camera kind of hung low for a lot of the movie. You got these nice, like, low-angle shots where it would just frame these characters against the sky. I don't know if that was a product of there maybe being things in the background that they didn't want to photograph and just trying to avoid that, or if it was an aesthetic decision. But it did kind of give them, like, these mythic traveler feeling. And then another scene I really loved aesthetically was just when our main character and the guy who she ends up palling around with are just sitting in this, like, tent, and they have these orange candle lights burning, and the whole scene is just washed in orange. And it's just really, like they just let it go so far. Like a lot of the time there would be a little more restraint, I think, in pulling it back and making it look naturalistic. But this, it has this kind of Mars orange look to the whole thing. And then a really nice cut that's, I think, Lawrence of Arabia shout out. But she blows one of the candles out, and then we just cut to this wide desert. And it's all, it's formally, it's pretty, it's pretty beautiful.
Mm-hmm. As far as moments, I would say the first image, capturing the snake in the beginning, the very first shot of the snake. Like you said, the filmmakers and the characters in the film and also the filmmakers did not seem afraid of nature. They seemed to embrace it, which goes along with the theme of the film as well. And that first shot of the snake, where it's close up on the snake and they're trying to capture it and bring it back. I think it's some sort of metaphor going on there. It works well to bring you into this world and sets up the rest of the movie quite nicely, I thought. So that's I think that's going to do it for Idaho Transfer. Any final thoughts, Jeremy, on this one?
No, just check it out. Like we said, public domain, short movie, under an hour and a half.
Yep.
So if
Our next one we're going to talk about is even shorter.
Yes.
And that one is Primer. And it's a length that I like. It's about, what is it, like 73 minutes or something like that?
Yeah, it's a quick one.
Yeah, but it's quick. But a lot going on. But we'll get into that for our final episode in this series. But until then, thanks for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on iTunes and Podbean, as well as on social media on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.